I believe that it is difficult to kill an idea because ideas are invisible and contagious and they move fast. Ideas spring up where you do not expect them, like weeds, and are as difficult to control. I believe that repressing ideas spreads ideas. I believe that people and books and newspapers are containers for ideas, but that burning people who hold the ideas will be as unsuccessful as firebombing the newspaper archives. It is already too late. It is always too late. The ideas are already out, hiding behind people's eyes, waiting in their thoughts. They can be whispered. They can be written on walls in the dead of night. They can be drawn. Why our future depends on libraries, reading, and daydreaming. I suggest that reading for pleasure is one of the most important things one can do. I am making a plea for people to understand what libraries and librarians are and to preserve both of these things. It is obviously in my interest for people to read, for them to read fiction, for libraries and librarians to exist and help foster a love of reading and places in which reading can occur. So I am biased as a writer, but I am much, much more biased as a reader. Everything changes when we read. People who cannot understand each other, cannot exchange ideas, cannot communicate. The simplest way to make sure that we raise literate children is to teach them to read and to show them that reading is a pleasurable activity. Fiction builds empathy. Fiction is something you build up from 26 letters and a handful of punctuation marks. And you alone. Using your imagination create a world. And people eat and look out through other eyes. You are being someone else, and when you return to your own world, you are going to be slightly changed. I was lucky. I had an excellent local library growing up and met the kind of librarians who did not mind a small, unaccompanied hearing boy heading back into the children's library every morning and working his way through the card catalogue, looking for books with ghosts or magic or rockets in them, looking for vampires or detectives or witches or wonders. They were good librarians. They liked books and they liked the books being read. They had no snobbery about anything I read. They just seemed to like that there was this wide eyed little boy who loved to read, and they would talk to me about the books I was reading. They would find me other books, they would help. They treated me with respect. I was not used to being treated with respect as an 8-year-old. Libraries are about freedom, freedom to read, freedom of ideas, freedom of communication. They're about education, about entertainment, about making safe spaces, and about access to information. A library is a place of safety, a haven from the world. It's a place with librarians in it. We need to teach our children to read and to enjoy reading. We need libraries, we need books, we need literate citizens. Fiction is the Books are the way that the dead communicate with us, the way that we learn lessons from those who are no longer with us, the way that humanity has built on itself, progressed, made knowledge incremental rather than something that has to be relearned over and over. We have an obligation to read for pleasure. It If others see us reading, we show that reading is a good thing. We have an obligation to support libraries, to protect the closure of libraries. If you do not value libraries, you are silencing the voices of the past and you are damaging the future. Fiction is the lie that tells the truth. We all have an obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It is easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that society is huge and the individual is less than nothing. But the truth is, individuals make the future, and they do it by imagining that things can be different. Albert Einstein was once asked how we could make our children intelligent. If you want your children to be intelligent, he said, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, you read them more fairy tales. Today, I intended to begin to write. Stories are waiting like distant thunderstorms, crumbling and flickering on the grey horizon. And there are emails and introductions, and a book, a whole damn book, about a country and a journey and belief. I am here to write. Attached the armrests with the screws, puzzling over the left and the right of it, the screws not being what they should be, as described in the instructions, and then the base beneath the seat, which attached with 640 screws that were puzzlingly 645 screws. Then the headpiece to the chair back, the chair back to the seat, which is where the problems start, as the middle screw on either side declines to penetrate and thread. This all takes time. Orson Orson Welles is Harry lying. On the on the old radio as I assemble my chair, Orson meets a dame and a crooked fortune teller and a fat man and a New York gang boss in exile, and has slept with the dame, solved the mystery, read the script and pocketed the money before I have assembled my chair. Making a book is a little like making a chair. Perhaps it ought to come with warnings like the chair instructions. A folder a folded piece of paper slipped into each copy, warning us only for one person at a time. Do not use as a stool or a stepladder. Failure to follow these warnings can result in serious injury. One day I will write another book, and when I am done, I will climb it like a stool or a stepladder, or a high old wooden ladder propped against the side of a plum tree in the autumn. And I will begin. But for now, I shall follow these warnings and finish making the chair. Next, make good art. I escaped from school as soon as I could when the prospect of 4 more years of enforced learning before I'd become the writer I wanted to be was stifling. I got out into the world. I wrote and I became a better writer the more I wrote. And I wrote some more, and nobody ever seemed to mind that. I was making it up as I went along. They just read what I wrote and they paid for it, or they didn't. And often they commissioned me to write something else for them, which has left me with a healthy respect and fondness for higher education that those of my friends and family who attended universities were cured of long ago. Looking back, I have had a remarkable ride. I am not sure I can call it a career, because a career implies that I had some kind of career plan. I never did. The nearest thing I had was a list I made when I was 15 of everything I wanted to do. To write an adult novel, a children's book, a comic, a movie, record an audiobook, write an episode of Doctor Who, and so on. I didn't have a career. I just did the next thing on the list. So I thought I would tell you everything. I had known starting out. And a few things that, looking back on it, I suppose that I did know. And that I would also give you the best piece of advice I had ever got, which I completely failed to follow. First of all, when you start out on a career in the arts, you have no idea what you are doing. This is great. People who know what they are doing know the rules and know what is possible and impossible. You do not, and you should not. The rules on what is possible and impossible, what is possible and impossible in the arts were made by people who had not tested the bounds of the possible by going beyond them. And you can. If you don't know it's impossible, it's easier to do. And because nobody's done it before, that they haven't made up rules to stop anyone doing that again yet. Because normally there are things you have to do because before you can get to the place you want to be. I wanted to write comics and novels and stories and films, so I became a journalist. Because journalists are allowed to ask questions and to simply go and find out how the world works. And besides, to do those things, I needed to write and to write well. And I was being paid to learn how to write economically, crisply, sometimes under adverse conditions and on time. Sometimes the way to do what you hope to do will be clear cut, and sometimes it will be almost impossible to decide whether or not you are doing the correct thing because you'll have to balance your goals and hopes with feeding yourself, paying debts, finding work, settling for what you can get. Something that worked for me was imagining that where I wanted to be, an author primarily of fiction, making good books, making good comics, and supporting myself through my words, was a mountain, a distant mountain, my goal. And I knew that as long as I kept walking towards the mountain, I would be alright. And when I truly was not sure what to do, I could stop and think about whether it was taking me towards or away from the mountain. I said no to editorial jobs on magazines, proper jobs that would have paid proper money because I knew that attractive though they were for me, they would have been walking away from the mountain. And if those offers had come along earlier, I might have taken them because they still would have been closer to the mountain than I was at the time. I learned to write by writing. I tended to do anything as long as it felt like an adventure and to stop when it felt like work, which meant life did not feel like work. Thirdly, when you start off, you have to deal with the problems of failure. You need to be thick skinned to learn that not every project will survive. A freelance life, a life in the arts, is sometimes like putting messages in bottles on a desert island and hoping that someone will find one of your bottles and open it and read it and put something in a bottle that will wash its way back to you, appreciation or commission or money or love. And you have to accept that you may put out 100 things for every bottle that winds up coming back. The problems of failure are problems of discouragement, of hopelessness, or of anger. You want everything to happen, and you want it now, and things go wrong. My first book, a piece of journalism I had done for the money and which had already bought me an electric typewriter from the advance, should have been a bestseller. It should have paid me a lot of money if the publisher hadn't gone into involuntary liquidation between the first print run selling out and the second printing, and before any royalties could be paid, it would have done. And I shrugged. and I still had my electric typewriter and enough money to pay the rent for a couple of months. And I decided that I would do my best in future not to write books just for the money. If you didn't get the money, then you didn't have anything. If I did work I was proud of and I didn't get the money, at least I would have the work. Every now and again I forget that rule, and whenever I do, I the universe kicks me hard and reminds me. I don't know that it's an issue for anybody but me, but it's true that nothing I did were the only reason for doing it was the money was ever worth it, except as bitter experience. Usually I didn't wind up getting the money either. The things I did because I was excited and wanted to see them exist in reality have never let me down, and I have never regretted the time I spent on any of them. The problems of failure are hard, the problems of success can be harder because nobody warns you about them. The first problem of any kind of even limited success is the unshakable conviction that you are getting away with something and that any moment now they will discover you. It's imposter syndrome, something my wife Amanda questioned the fraud police. In my case, I was convinced that there would be a knock on the door and a man with a clipboard. I don't know why he carried a clipboard in my head, but he did. Would be there, tell me it was all over and they had caught up with me, and now I would have to go and get a real job. One that didn't consist of making things up and writing them down and reading books I wanted to read. And then I would go away quietly and get the kind of job where you don't have to make things up anymore. The problems of success. They are real, and with luck, you'll experience them. The point where you stop saying yes to everything because now the bottles you threw in the ocean are all coming back and have to learn to say no. I want I watched my peers and my friends and the ones who were older than me and watched how miserable some of them were. I had listened to them telling me that they couldn't envisage a world where they did what they had always wanted to do anymore because now they had to earn a certain amount every month just to keep where they were. They couldn't go and do the things that mattered and that they had really wanted to do, and that seemed as big a tragedy as any problem of failure. And after that, the biggest problem of success is that the world conspires to stop you doing the thing that you do because you are successful. There was a day when I looked up and realized that I had become someone who professionally replied to email and who wrote as a hobby. I started answering fewer emails and was relieved to find I was writing much more. Life is sometimes hard. Things go wrong in life and in love and in business and in friendship and in health and in all the other ways that life can be wrong. And when things get tough, that is what you should do. Make good art. I am serious. Husband runs off with a politician. Make good art. Leg crushed and then eaten by mutated boa constrictor. Make good art. IRS on your trail. Make good art. Cat exploded. Make good art. Somebody on the internet thinks what you do is stupid or evil or it's all been done before. Make good art. Probably things will work out somehow and eventually time will take the sting away, but that doesn't matter. Do what only you do best. Make good art. Make it on the good days too. And fifthly, while you are at it, make your art. Do the stuff that only you can do. The urge starting out is to copy, and that's not a bad thing. Most of us only find our own voices after we have sounded like a lot of other people. The one thing that you have that nobody else has is you. Your voice, your mind, your story, your vision. So write and draw and build and play and dance and live as only you can. And sometimes the things I did really didn't work. There are stories of mine that have never been reprinted. Some of them never even left the house. But I learned as much from them as I did from the things that worked. Sixthly, I will pass on some secret freelancer knowledge. Secret knowledge is always good, and it is useful for anyone who ever plans to create art for other people to enter a freelance world of any kind. I learned it in comics, but it applies to other fields, and it's this: people get hired because somehow they get hired. In my case, I did something which these days would be easy to check and would get me into trouble. And when I started out in those pre-internet days, seemed like a sensible career strategy. When I was asked by editors who I had worked for, I lied. I used a handful of magazines that sounded likely, and I sounded confident. I listed a handful of magazines that sounded likely, and I sounded confident, and I got jobs. I then made it a point of honor to have written for each of the magazines I had listed to get that first job, so that I hadn't actually lied. I had just been chronologically challenged. You get work however you get work. People keep working in a freelance world, and more of today's world is freelance because their work is good, and two, because they are easy to get along, and three, because they deliver the work on time. And you don't even need all three. Two out of three is fine. People will tolerate how unpleasant you are if your work is good and you deliver it on time. They'll forgive the lateness of the work if it's good and if they like you. And you don't have to be as good as the others if you are on time, and it's always a pleasure to hear from you. I started trying to think what the best advice I had been given over the years was, and it came from Stephen King. 20 years ago, at the height of the success of Sandman, I was writing a comic that people loved and were taking seriously. King liked Sandman and my novel with Teddy Pratchett, Good Omens, and he saw the madness, the long signing lines, all that, and his advice was this is really great, you should enjoy it, and I didn't. Best advice I got that I ignored. Instead, I worried about it. I worried about the next deadline, the next idea, the next story. There wasn't a moment for the next 14 or 15 years that I wasn't writing something in my head or wondering about it. And I didn't stop and look around and go, this is really fun. I wish to I wish I had enjoyed it more. It's been an amazing ride. But there were parts of the ride I missed because I was too worried about things going wrong, about what came next to enjoy the beat I was on. That was the hardest lesson for me, I think. To let go and enjoy the ride because the ride takes you to some remarkable and unexpected places. I wish you luck. Luck is useful. Often you will discover that the harder you work and the more wisely you work, the luckier you get. But there is luck and it helps. We are in a transitional world right now. If you are in any kind of artistic field, because the nature of distribution is changing, the models by which creators get their work out into the world and got their work out into the world and got to keep a roof over the heads and buy sandwiches while they did that are all changing. I have talked to people at the top of the food chain in publishing, in book selling, in all those areas. And nobody knows what the landscape will look like 2 years from now, let alone a decade away. The distribution channels that people had built over the last century or so are in flux. For print, for visual artists, for musicians, for creative people of all kinds, which is, on one hand, intimidating and on the other, immensely liberating. The rules, the assumptions, the now we are supposed to's of how you get your work seen and what you do then are breaking down. The gatekeepers are leaving their gates. You can be as creative as you need to be to get your work seen. YouTube and the web and whatever comes after YouTube and the web can give you more people watching than television ever did. The old rules are crumbling, and nobody knows that the new rules are so and nobody knows what the new rules are. So make up your own rules. Someone asked me recently how to do something she thought was going to be difficult. In this case, recording an audiobook, and I suggested she pretend that she was someone who could do it. Not pretend to do it, but pretend she was someone who could. She put up a notice to this effect on the studio wall and she said it helped. So be wise, because the world needs more wisdom. And if you cannot be wise, pretend to be someone who is wise and then just behave like they would. Make interesting, amazing, glorious, fantastic mistakes. Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.